We live in a world where we have to make these incredibly complex, high-stakes decisions. We're talking about things like planning city infrastructure or redesigning entire global supply chains. The choices we make today, they're going to have consequences for decades to come. So the big question is, are the tools we're using to make these choices really up to the task?
And that really gets to the heart of what we're talking about today. How in the world do we navigate all the trade-offs between social well-being, our ecological limits, and, economic viability? This is the core challenge that frameworks like Doughnut Economics bring into such sharp focus. And honestly, it's a challenge that demands a totally new way of thinking.
All right, let's dive in. Here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start by looking at the real challenges of making decisions today. Then we'll put it to the test with the Doughnut framework. After that, we'll explore why our current tools just aren't cutting it. And finally, we'll see how a new approach, called Planetary Intelligence, can help us make much better, more defensible choices for the future.
So, let's get real. Why do today's most critical decisions feel almost impossible to get right? Well, it turns out they all pretty much share a common DNA, a set of characteristics that makes them uniquely and frustratingly difficult.
Yeah, these aren't simple problems where there's just one right answer. You're trying to juggle multiple, often competing goals, like keeping costs down while also improving environmental impact. You're hemmed in by very real constraints, from budgets to the laws of physics. And a lot of these choices, like building a new bridge or a transit line, are basically permanent. And the big one? Every single decision has to be justified to stakeholders, to boards, to regulators, and to all of us.
Okay, so that's the theory. But how does this all play out in the real world? Let's take a look at a really powerful example. The Doughnut Economics framework is kind of the perfect stress test for these kinds of complex decisions, especially for cities that are trying to become more sustainable.
So for anyone who's not familiar with the concept, Doughnut Economics is all about finding that sweet spot. It's about making sure everyone has the resources they need for a good life. That's the social foundation, the inside of the donut, without overshooting our planet's ecological limits, which is the outside of the donut. It's a beautifully simple idea, right? But actually putting it into practice, well, that's incredibly complex.
Just try to put yourself in a city planner's shoes for a second. A single decision about a new transport system creates these massive ripple effects. It impacts housing, carbon emissions, how we use land, the city's budget, and even long-term political goals. All of these things are deeply tangled together, but we rarely have the tools to see and reason across all those connections at once.
And this brings us to a really critical point. If the problems are this interconnected, why are the tools we're using to solve them so, disconnected? It feels like we have what you might call a decision intelligence gap.
Now, this is what's so interesting. Let's look at our go-to tools. Dashboards, they show us a bunch of numbers in isolation, but they totally hide the cause and effect relationships between them. Spreadsheets are a classic. They're just full of hidden assumptions that nobody can track. Reports give us a snapshot in time, but not the living, breathing model. And even the latest conversational AIs, sure, they can pull up information, but they don't give you a stable, logical framework for making a choice you can actually defend.
So, if our old tools are broken, what's the solution? This brings us to the core insight behind a system called Planetary Intelligence, or PI for short. And it's a fundamental shift in how we even approach the problem.
The first thing we all have to realize is that the answer isn't just to throw more data or faster computers at the problem. We are drowning in data. What we're missing is something else entirely. And here it is. This is the big idea. The solution isn't the data itself, it's the connections between the data. What planetary intelligence argues is that making these relationships explicit isn't just a nice-to-have, it's the absolute foundation for being able to reason reliably about any complex system. So let's be really clear. We don't have a data problem, we have a reasoning problem. The failure is one of decision intelligence, our ability to pull together all the relevant context, see the trade-offs clearly, and build a logical, understandable case for a course of action.
Okay, so how does Pi actually pull this off? Let's break down its ecosystem and see how it turns this idea of connected context into a practical tool you can actually use.
It all follows this simple but really powerful three-step workflow. First, you build a kind of digital twin of your world, a structured map of all your assets, your constraints, your goals, and crucially, the cause and effect links between them. Then, you use a reasoning engine to ask complex questions and explore different scenarios on top of that map. And finally, and this is key, the knowledge you create gets compounded, so insights build over time instead of just getting lost in old reports.
Now to make this work, Pi is really smart about how it handles information. It splits it into 3 buckets. First, you've got reference data. This is the stable, foundational knowledge about how things actually work, like the physics of a power grid. Then you have your live data feeds, things like sensor readings or economic indicators. And finally, you have derived intelligence, which is the output of your reasoning, like a side-by-side comparison of 2 different policies. This structure is what lets you combine durable understanding with live data to produce insights you can trust.
This is all managed through 3 distinct modules. So let's go back to our city planner. They'd use the context builder to suck in city plans, environmental reports, and expert interviews, turning all of that into a connected knowledge graph, a dynamic map of their city. Then in the studio, they could ask something like, what are the top 3 strategies to reduce our transport emissions while also improving housing affordability? And Pime Commons gives them a huge head start, providing foundational models about things like urban economics, so they're never starting from a blank page.
Okay, so what's the ultimate payoff here? What does this new capability actually let an organization do? I mean, what does a better decision actually look like in practice?
Well, it enables decisions that are first and foremost grounded in an explicit map of reality, not buried in some mysterious spreadsheet. They're informed by a credible knowledge base. They're transparent about what's known and what isn't. And because of all that, they become defensible to regulators, to the board, and to the public for years and years to come.
And this is so important. The system doesn't just spit out an answer. It produces what's called a decision artifact, a complete auditable record of the reasoning, the data that was used, and the trade-offs that were considered. This becomes a lasting knowledge asset for the whole organization, which means you can have true institutional learning.
Which leaves us with a final, kind of provocative thought. For so long, our biggest challenges, from climate change to urban inequality, have been held back by our inability to make and defend complex, long-term choices. But what if we can now make our reasoning totally transparent, inspectable, and accountable? What does that unlock? What great challenges will we finally dare to take on?